I wanted to make a goat skull to decorate my Norse-inspired shed that I'd recently built. Here's how I went about it. I decided to use traditional paper mache and paper mache clay to make the skull and then waterproof it later on. I inserted stiff wire into a pool noodle cut in half to make the horns. The noodle was surprisingly easy to carve with a sharp knife, and this gave them the taper required to make the form. Using my reference picture, I bent the horns to shape. I covered each horn with masking tape applied fairly tightly, and then covered them in small bits of torn paper soaked with PVA adhesive. I diluted the adhesive a bit with coloured water that made the glue a bit easier to see. I allowed this to dry and then gave each of them a second coat with the same material. To make the bony part of the skull, I first used my reference drawings to help draw a cardboard template. I placed the horns in situ to help me get the scale of the drawing right. It was difficult to get the drawing symmetrical, so I cut a quick template of one side and flipped it over to get a better symmetrical result. The armature of the skull was to be made from crumpled silver foil, but I needed to include a wooden block so that I had a firm place to mount it once it was completed. I had to cut a couple of shoulders on the wood to make it fit the template. Once again, making use of my reference photos and a real goat skull that I already had, I used crumpled aluminium foil to create the form and held the bits together with hot melt glue. The foil completely enclosed the wooden mounting block. Paper mache clay starts with toilet paper that's been soaked, pulverised and partly squeezed to remove the excess water. To this are added almost equal parts PVA glue and builder's stopping plaster. These ingredients are mixed together and spread thinly over the foil armature. The coating can be allowed to dry naturally or baked in a low oven for 20 to 30 minutes if you want to speed it up. I added some fine detail with a little more plaster coated onto the surface and screwed a longer block of wood onto the back of the piece so that I could hold it easier. Then I drilled and glued a couple of dowels into the head using Gorilla Glue. I had not used this glue before, but it turned out to be the perfect material for attaching the dowels, as it expands as it dries, and therefore created a nice firm matrix inside the foil, strong enough to hold the horns. I then had the idea that I could cover the whole piece with Gorilla Glue to make it waterproof, which turned out okay, except that in the first instance I made a rookie error. I'd cleaned up the glue the previous day with methylated spirits, so I thought I could thin the glue with meths in order to brush it on easier. Turns out this was not a good idea, as the glue just bubbled up into a sticky, gooey mess. I managed to tame it down though with constant brushing until the glue had nearly dried and ended up with a reasonably plastic-like waterproof covering over the whole piece. I also discovered that by stippling the nearly dried glue, I could get quite a convincing bone-like texture on the bony part of the skull. I ended up having to throw the brush away. To finish the skull, I cut the protruding wires off the horns and attached them also with Gorilla Glue. I cut off the wooden handle bit at the top of the head and left the bottom of the block in place so I could mount the skull. I finished the surface firstly with a coat of white paint, followed with black wash to fill the base of the cracks and hollows on the surface. Lastly, I gave a light dry brush coating to the high parts with white, on the skull and also on the horns. A circular mounting plate and some rope additions completed the piece that now hangs proudly above the Norse-inspired shed.